My name is Gareth Whitehurst. I was born on December 23rd in 1941. I don't know what day of the week that was. I'm good looking, but I'm not perfect. This looks to be what remains of the old Columbia Hospital. So somewhere on the third floor was the maternity ward, evidently. So that's where it all started. I don't recall anything specifically about the day I was born. My parents never mentioned it in particular. I don't recall my mother giving me any details about her birthing experience, so I have nothing in my consciousness over which I should feel particularly guilty, I guess, having come out on time. Well, it was interesting to have a birthday 2 days before Christmas. Obviously, my favorite relatives were the ones that sent 2 presents. This crap about combining presents, it just didn't make any sense to me. I didn't care if the combination was supposed to be more glorious than 2 singletons. I'd have rather had the 2 singletons because to me that was a sign of real love and affection. I have no recollection of the birth itself, except that there just seemed to be a lot of paperwork to sign when I first came out. Those things have come to seed or have come to bloom later on in my life, and I realized what they really meant. I had no inkling at the time. Gareth came from a character in a novel by Grace Livingston Hill, who was a famous woman author at the time and whom my mom enjoyed very much. I've always said that I wanted to go track down what novel it was by Grace Livingston Hill that the name Gareth appears in. The Ray, my middle name, was my grandfather's name, Raymond, or Ray Moffat, rather. It wasn't Raymond, it was just Ray. And, of course, Whitehurst being the family name. My grandfather always would occasionally offer this hint that we had some partial claim to some big old castle in Scotland. That was as far as his exposition went, so I never tracked it down. But the clan in Scotland was actually the Maffit clan. And when Maffits would come to this country, I'm sure they went through Ellis Island or whatever the mill was. It got spelled a number of, I've seen Moffat many different ways, some with an M-O-F-F-A-T-T, M-O-F-F-E-T-T, M-O-F-F-E-T. Anyhow, it was a border clan, which meant it was right in the south of Scotland near the English border. So they were not Highlanders, they were Lowlanders. Usually in most of the clans, there's some worldwide leader of the clan. At the time, this was some years back, the Maffit clan had no worldwide leader. They were kind of taking applications or something. I almost had a thought about applying, but then I thought, well, probably more fussing than I want to deal with. I don't know, my first real sense of conscious memory, it was related to a Christmas experience and a couple of the toys that I got, but I have no idea what year it was. I remember there was a little desk that you could sit at, looked like a school desk, but on the desktop were a bunch of little holes. And you had a huge bunch of little, they were wooden at the time, little round things with pegs on them you could take and put in those holes and create a design. And I remember one of those deals where you're given a little apparatus that has holes of different shapes in it, and you have to pick the shape that fits it, put it in, pound it with a little wooden hammer, and it drops through or something like that. And I remember a rocking chair that had a little device on one of the rockers that would sort of play a tune like a music box tune or something when you rocked. When I taught mathematics in late 60s in Indiana, junior and senior high math, I thought for one Christmas it might be fun for the kids for me to dig out some of my old home movies. My dad was quite a home movie buff. So we got through a couple of them in black and white, and the kids were all delighted to see Mr. Whitehurst, as a little kid. So here comes the one in color, and I'm all excited. I thought, well, they're really going to enjoy this. And I have this long curly hair. And here's Christmas morning, and presents are out there, and here I come waddling in. I'm in like a bathrobe. And I hadn't previewed this thing all the way through. So I'm there, and I'm getting ready to explore these toys. So I bend down on my knees to access one of the toys on the floor, and of course the robe opens up, and I don't have any underwear on or anything. So here's Mr. Whitehurst all hanging out for everyone to see. The kids just went nuts. And we just had a great laugh about it. Of course, I shut it off because I didn't know how long I could endure that kind of exposure, no pun intended, before I would get some kind of a censure from the school board or something. But that was funny. So obviously we altered and adjusted the program for the next class. But, I couldn't make a big deal about it or feel overly fussy because I didn't want to overemphasize the experience. I just took it in stride. When we were living in Pittsburgh, my first memory is that we lived upstairs in a huge old Victorian home that my grandparents rented. This was on Trenton Avenue in Wilkinsburg. They had subdivided it into several different apartments, and my mom and dad, I was the only child at the time, so we lived upstairs somewhere. And I remember that this apartment had an actual ice box. Periodically, the man would, come with the ice tongs and a block of ice on his back and put it in the ice box. That was the refrigerator. My dad, who worked at Westinghouse, got this intercom. There was a couple of boxes about 1 foot square or something, and a wire that he fished down through the wall 2 stories down so that my mom and her mom, my grandmother, could talk to each other between floors without having to run up and down the stairs or something. And I kept that for a long period of time and lost it when I lived in Rockville. And I regretted having lost control of that thing. The bathroom that we used was a flight down. There wasn't a bathroom on the level where our apartment was. At whatever age I was, I had not yet mastered the fine art of self-cleaning after taking a crap. And I would holler up the stairs, "Daddy, come wipe me." He'd come down and perform the obligatory function. After a while, he decided that it was probably time for me to get a little more independent in this regard. And so he said, Gary, we don't want to do this anymore. And I can't remember specifically what kind of lesson or tutorial he gave me about how to clean myself. After that, we moved to our own house in a place called Irwin, PA, which is south side of Pittsburgh. My dad worked for Westinghouse in Pittsburgh, and his brothers, my uncles, worked for Westinghouse Research, which is also right there in the environs of Pittsburgh. When we moved out to Irwin, that was during the time or right after my sister Judy's birth, which would have been 3 years behind my own. And I remember that Judy had colic. She just cried all the time. It was hateful, but there it was. It drove my parents nuts. But it eventually passed, but it was laborious at the time, I guess. When we were still in Wilkinsburg, I went from kindergarten. There wasn't any preschool then. I went from kindergarten through the first half of third grade at Turner School that we saw and filmed. And I was a very good student. I was 4 years old when they let me start kindergarten because my birthday being in December, I was going to be 5 before the end of the calendar year. And my kindergarten class, as I recall, was through this entrance and to the left. And I had a huge crush on my kindergarten teacher. I can almost remember her name. But then when I went to first grade, I was 1 or 2 windows down on this side. My first grade teacher was Mrs. Lindquist. And most of what I remember from there is just doing rainbows on paper when I was learning to do cursive writing. And I went here halfway through my third grade, and then we moved to Maryland in '49. When I went here, all along the sidewalk down here and on the opposite side was a really thick, they were bramble bushes. I mean, they were meant to be hedges, but they had we took bus stop. They had brambles on them. And when I was in first grade, of course, I used to walk this way to go home. And there was some guy in third grade that just took an inordinate interest in, well, today you'd call it bullying or something. He would just always mess around with me. And one of his favorite things was to push me into the bramble bushes, so the stickers would get me. And after a while, I turned him in, so to speak, but it didn't seem to do any good. Nothing seemed to dissuade this guy. So one day I went out back after school, and I discovered that halfway up the hill there was a pathway that went from here all the way down to the back of my house. So I took, for a fair while, taking the back path on the hill home, so he never did catch me out here anymore. So he taught me a good lesson, that sometimes in face of overwhelming odds, it's best to learn the science of evasion rather than confrontation.
Look, he's not bringing any books home either. He never carried books home.
You know, actually, I don't remember taking books home. And then finally, our last house was the one on Laketon Road, which we visited. So, I'd be coming down here from school, and we lived in this house from, I think, about 1944 or 45 till 1949 when the family moved to the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. in December of that year. My family lived on the first floor. It's a duplex. My aunt and uncle and my grandparents lived on the top floor. At some point, I don't remember when, my grandmother had a fall down those steps that go from the second floor all the way down to this entrance. And she broke her ankle and took her to the hospital and so on. She had to use a cane ever since that time. But in the garage here, my dad had stuff. He was always working on something. And I remember 2 years in a row, we went and bought a Christmas tree. We came home here, set it up in the garage, and my dad spray painted the tree silver. And then we put it up in the sunroom here. With 1 year we had blue balls on it. The next year we had red balls on it. And he put a spotlight up that would shine then on the Christmas tree, and it was beautiful. I'd never seen anything like it before. Next door here, there was a guy, a boy that went to Turner School, and he was kind of a bad person, and always trying to get in trouble. Over here, this house was occupied by people by the name of Sleppy, and the boy there's name was Dick Sleppy. We used to pal around some.
I think I was probably about 3. And we lived on Langton Road in Wilkinsburg. And I just remember this big old 2-story house with a garage underneath. And I remember swallowing my first pill. And that's like a major feat, I guess, for a 3-year-old. I don't know. But I remember him standing beside my mother, watching me, like, is she going to do it? Is she going to do it? And I, they were both very surprised that I actually did it. Another one was, I was the only girl on the street. There were always plenty of little boys for Gary to play with. I really didn't have a girlfriend to play with. So I remember I was always following them around. They were playing cowboys, Indians. It didn't matter. I was always in the rear. I was always bringing up the rear, trying to keep up with all of them.
So some kids and I were just playing around up in here, and I came down this hill, and I tumbled. I stumbled and was ready to fall. I put my hands out in front of me, and this palm caught a broken bottle. And the scar is still there. You can see it. My mom finally got it sort of bandaged up and the blood stopped. And she said, well, we'll have to wait till your dad comes home to see whether or not we need to go get stitches. And boy, I just kept those bandages in nice order and everything. And when Dad got home, I said, yeah, see, Dad, it's healing well. These bandages will really work. I said, it's feeling better even now. And he opened it up and he saw that it was a very deep wound. And he said, "Nah, son, we're going to have to go get stitches." So he brought me down to the hospital, and they took me in, and a nurse was going to give me a tetanus shot. I assume it was a tetanus shot. And she came in the room, and she's preparing the hypodermic. And she was getting ready to administer the shot, and I just started screaming like a banshee. My dad later told me, he said, "Son, I could hear you all the way down the hall." And the funny thing of it is, she looked at me, and I realized that the needle wasn't in my arm, so I stopped screaming. And she said, "I don't know why you're screaming. I haven't even given you the shot yet." So we went through that again. But then when they went to do the stitches, I don't know why, but they didn't have like a local anesthetic at the time to numb the so they had to give them to me totally conscious. I remember they laid me down on a table. They put this hand out on a board and this hand out on a board. They had people grabbing my arm, holding it to the board so I couldn't move while they did the stitching. Somebody grabbing this one just so I couldn't flail or something with it. And the nurse forced me to put my head in this direction so I couldn't see what they were doing over there on my palm. And finally got through it. But that's where it happened. Way up at the top of the hill, there was Milliken Brick Company. They actually had brick ovens. They actually made brick up there. And they were there for a long time. Across the street here, there was a drugstore. And my dad had bought me a bank. My dad had bought me this bank. It was like a cash register. And once you put in the first coin, the bank was locked until you got to $10. Of course, you know, back in the late 40s, that was a lot of money. Especially, I only got an allowance of 25 cents a week. Sometimes he'd give it to me in change because we had to take a tithe, 10%. And
Right.
Put it in the offering. Anyhow, they had in this drugstore, they had a squirt gun, and it had a long aluminum barrel, probably an inch and a half in diameter, and there was a nozzle on the end of it, and you would shoot this thing by turning a handle, kind of like a Gatling gun or something. And that was the neatest thing I had ever seen. I lusted after that squirt gun. I just wanted that gun so bad, I decided I was going to break into that piggy bank and get the money for it. So somehow I got into that thing. I got the money. I got that gun. And it was a tense pleasure, however, because I knew somehow, sooner or later, there was going to be an accounting for that piggy bank. When allowance time came, my dad gave me the quarter, and he says, "Okay, go get your bank." Well, obviously, there wasn't any bank to give, or to get. I'd come down into the basement of the house here, which was behind the garage wall inside, and I hid it behind some debris next to the old coal furnace that would heat the house. After a period of time, Dad says, where's the piggy bank? Where's the banks? And I said, it was a duplex, upstairs, downstairs. My Aunt Lola lived upstairs. And for a while, grandparents lived up there too. I said, oh, I took it. I've left it upstairs at Aunt Lola's. Oh, okay. So life goes on.
I wasn't cognizant enough to realize that at some point that story wasn't going to hold out anymore. But I didn't worry about it for a while. One day, Salvation Army or something like that was coming around through the neighborhood to ask if people had any donations.
And he winds up foraging around the basement for stuff to give to the Salvation Army. And lo and behold, there's my bank smashed open down there behind the furnace.
So it was hidden, it was jimmied open, the story was obvious. So later that day, I guess, he called me into the bedroom and asked me about the bank. I told him the same thing. Yeah, it was still up at Aunt Lola's. And he told me afterwards that it was certainly in part the act of breaking into the bank, taking the money out, but it was equally about my lying about it, and so he had an early version of an electric razor.
The razor cord that he had went to his electric shaver, and he'd take that thing and fold it up in about 4 things, and it would have made a perfect cat o' nine tails.
And he just walled the daylights out of me, primarily, from my butt down my legs to my knee.
And I had welts on my leg. He was so, because I had done all this intervening lying about where the bank was or what was happening, And
I remember after it was over, he just left me alone to pout and cry. But I couldn't wait to go upstairs and show my grandparents and my aunt and uncle the terrible thing my dad had done to my leg, They were all up in arms, they thought he was a monster and all this kind of stuff, but it all blew over.
If it happened today, somebody would have called juvenile welfare.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But I can't ever remember him, doing anything that wasn't justified. The amount of punishment, you could debate, perhaps, but it wasn't anything that was that severe or life-threatening. I was 8 years old. Yeah, 8 years old when we moved south. I don't remember any great knowledge or understanding about my dad's position on race or whatever. He was an intelligent man and a rational man. I'm sure that if whatever the popular prejudices of the day were, he probably was not totally immune to them, but I never heard him say anything of a racist nature up to that point in time. As we drove south, we obviously crossed the Mason-Dixon line. And I didn't know what that meant. I had no notion of racism, north, south, those kinds of issues yet. And we stopped at a restaurant. We were all going to eat. Now, accompanying us was a black lady who had been good friends with my mom and had offered to help her make the move and get set up and so on, just a gesture of friendship between the two of them. So we piled into the restaurant, and we were all there in a booth and an extra chair or something, as I recall. We'd have been my mom and dad, my sister Judy and I, and this black lady. And the waitress came and put a glass of water down in front of everybody but the black lady. And I just thought, well, she can only carry, 4 glasses at a time. I don't know if she had a tray or what. I assumed she was going to come back with another glass of water. She never came back with the water. When she came back, she brought menus and put them in front of everybody except the black woman. And my dad's taking all this in, I guess, and she indicates that she's ready to take orders. And my dad said, well, you know, we need to give this lady, the black lady, a menu so she can order too. And the waitress said, well, you know, we don't serve blacks in the main dining room. She can place an order if she wants to go out back to a window for coloreds. And my dad didn't say anything. Everybody just sat there in silence. And he said, well, we'll go eat somewhere else. We all got out into the car and drove off. I can't remember what happened when we stopped again to eat, but that he found that offensive and unacceptable at the time. It was kind of my first, you know, inkling into notion of race and prejudice and so on. You know, I didn't know, I didn't have a full-blown inkling about it, but it obviously was triggering something in my thought process that somewhere in my dad's mid-teens, he had some event that triggered in him a desire to preach the gospel. And so he had some kind of a religious experience with Christianity. And even though he was a welder and somewhat machinist for Westinghouse, he felt this calling to do something, to preach the gospel. And he developed just on his own a series of ministries, which included offering interdenominational sermons at differing venues, people that he had come to know, preachers and so on. He also established going to the Allegheny County Jail down in Pittsburgh and holding religious services for the inmates. My mom, who was a fantastic hymn player, they bought a small miniature Este pump organ that folded up and collapsed, and you could carry it like a suitcase, a big suitcase, but you turn that up and she could pump it and play. I don't know, it had 3.5 or 4 octaves on it or something. When I started taking music lessons in my pre-teens in Rockville, and my teacher's trying to get me to sight read, you know, to me, sharps and flats were the devil. My mom didn't matter. I don't know what her musical training experience was from her childhood up, but the more sharps and flats, the better she liked it. She could sit down, just give her a hymnal. Don't give her Bach or Beethoven, just give her a hymnal, and she could play anything by sight, and she would always embellish it, you know, all over the keyboard. I was amazed at her, and when I came home and started playing more classical music, she was amazed at me, but I knew that her talent was much more amazing than mine, because she could sight read all those sharps and flats. So he would take the family at the time, and we'd go down into the seedier sections of Pittsburgh, you know, where the bars were and the nightlife of a more dubious nature were. His PA system ran off the 6-volt car battery. He'd set up this little PA system, a speaker and a microphone and so on. My mom was there with the organ, and he would just start a church service. I was there. I still have the old tambourine. The skin's gone out of it, but I'd hold gospel tracts in that thing and go around and hand them to anybody who came and was standing there and gathering and listening to the service. And then he would periodically he would go to the hospital and just go in and visit sick people. I don't know how he got permission or how he chose who he was going to visit. And he would just minister to them like a church minister would go in and visit a parishioner. And finally, we would drive out from Pittsburgh to the east into the Allegheny Mountains. And we'd go up into these little mountain communities, literally dirt roads, up into the hills. And we'd find these little villages or whatever the heck they were. You might have a row of houses on a dirt street, 8, 10, 12 of them. And we'd set up and we'd hold church services there out in the mountains. I remember one time coming down the street was a member of the town there, and he had the very stereotypical jug, over his shoulder or something that he could take a nip from now and again. I don't know whether he was saying anything and being belligerent or he just was there and walking towards my folks. But another middle-aged to older lady went in her little cabin or house, came out literally with a broom, and went after this guy, whacking him in the head to get him to get the heck on past us and leave us alone. So it was an interesting experience, my dad, with his sense of calling. Well, anyhow, at some point, he went to attend a series of lectures on the last days that was being held at Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall in Pittsburgh. And they were sponsored by the Seventh-day Adventists. And one of their primary evangelists or scholars or Bible teachers, whatever, was giving these series of lectures on the end times. And the gentleman's name was George Vandeman. And my dad, who was always very intellectually and academically oriented, was just really intrigued by such a cogent interpretation of these scriptures in Daniel and Revelation primarily. Of course, the Seventh-day Adventists also had the distinguishing characteristic of worshiping on a Saturday, like the Jews. They observed the Jewish Sabbath. They also followed most of the Jewish dietary laws and that sort of thing. But they were Christians in that they believed in Jesus, the second coming, hence the Adventist seventh day, because they worshiped on the seventh day. But he thought they had pretty much the right spin on things. And I guess he talked to Vandeman and the powers that be for quite some time, and he decided that maybe this was the time to make the break from the secular world and go full-blown into his religious calling. So the Adventists had their primary theological seminary and college in Tacoma Park, which is right on the borderline of Washington, D.C. And so he decided to move the whole family down to Tacoma Park so that he could attend college. Now, he knew that he couldn't just go and leave the secular world cold turkey, because he had to support the family. So he transferred his employment from Westinghouse in Pittsburgh to Westinghouse in Baltimore. It was about a 40-mile drive from Tacoma Park to Baltimore. He drove that every day because he worked a 40-hour week, as well as going to college almost full-time, a full schedule. And fortunately, he was a sharp fellow, so he pulled that off.
When we first moved here, we bought it brand new. They built the house for us, and it was in 1951. I was 10 years old and lived here until I was about 16 or 17. And then we moved further down the road for the balance of my high school career. It's funny, we bought this house in 51 for, I don't know, somewhere around $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 max. My sister bought it for my mom for $11,000 or $12,000, and last time I was able to get anybody to open up when I visited here, doggone things were going for about close to $250,000. Just unbelievable.
Gary and Dad had such a very tight bond. They both had like photographic memories. They intellectually were kind of the same. And he would even take him to his college classes when Gary wasn't in school. And he learned Greek at a very young age. You know, he was like a sponge. You know, whatever Dad knew, he would pick it up in some form or another.
I remember having to get up at 6 in the morning, especially when we lived out in Rockville. It was, I don't know, it must have been a half-hour, 45-minute drive into the college. But he had a 7 a.m. Greek class. And because I was going to one of the Adventist parochial schools there in Tacoma Park, he had to take me in there. And I had to go first to the Greek class, and then he'd take me over to the school. So I knew the Greek alphabet at a very young age. My memories of Mom were just sort of typical maternal type things. I knew that she worked. I remember when she worked selling shoes and real estate when we lived in Pittsburgh. I just know that she did that. I don't remember much about the experience or her work experiences or anything that particularly came home to me. I knew that I'd much rather be disciplined by my mom than my dad. And she was a great cook. I remember good food in Pittsburgh or Wilkinsburg. Well, yeah, it isn't that my mom's expectations were any less than my dad's, but my dad was just more, willing to make sure that they got transferred into my set of behavioral skills than she was. And there were a couple of interesting encounters in that regard. We were, generally a loving family. We did a lot of things together, vacations, special things, times together. My dad liked the outdoors. We did a fair amount of family reunions. They were popular, at least among our extended family. We had relatives primarily from eastern Ohio or near the Pennsylvania border. I remember going out into farm country and seeing cousins and relatives that I never knew I had. Big food, outdoors, all of that sort of thing. When we moved to Maryland, we were a little older, and Byron and Norma Claire were born. We'd occasionally go back to a state park. It was called Cooser State Park.
I remember they had a spring-fed lake that was freezing, and we'd stay in these old CC camp cabins that only had cold running water. They didn't have bathrooms. So I remember trotting out in the freezing cold night, even in the summer in the mountains, and using the outhouse and shivering to death getting in the water, but we still got in it. And it had a little man-made beach.
I remember one time we were driving to the lake, and all the big kids got to ride on the back of the car. I guess it was a station wagon we had, so they flipped the back down, and they got to ride on the back. And my dad made me ride up in the seat, and I was having a screaming tizzy fit, and he finally agreed to let me go back there and sit in my brother's lap or something. And
there was a lake there that was spring-fed. It was cold enough to freeze your blood, but we go swimming anyhow. That's where I actually learned to swim there.
My cousin trying to practice his life-saving and trying to drown me out in the lake and then pretend to save me, on inadvertently forgetting that he actually was holding me under the water. So by the time he actually got me to land, I was half drowned, and my brother sort of trying to help resuscitate me.
At least 1 or 2 days, all the cousins from Pennsylvania, Ohio, whatever, would all come, and we'd be under this huge pavilion, and we'd have picnics and things like that. Those are really, very vivid memories.
But those were really great times because of the togetherness of the family during those times. The kids and I, we'd just take a lot of stuff for playing with. One of our favorites was jacks. We used to play jacks. I was a whiz at jacks, man. I could, just 7 to 8s, whatever it was. I was a great jack player. And but we'd take these like coloring book rolls that and they go for yards, and we'd do those. We'd put puzzles together, just anything that was kind of these really homespun game activities.
So I remember, or even Dad taking us down to Rock Creek Park and just swimming there in the big creek.
My dad would when he wanted to study, he liked to study outdoors. We'd find a picnic table, and didn't always make a picnic of it, but we kids then, we'd go kind of semi-swimming in Rock Creek. Rock Creek wasn't river quality, but, it occasionally had a little bit of a pool area where you could sit down and get really wet. And then out to Sugarloaf Mountain, which was up towards Frederick, and that had some real granite outcroppings that you could literally climb the boulders. That was always fun. So we'd go up there and mess around. It's a wonder we didn't kill ourselves. Dad was just down below at the picnic table doing his studying. I was often let to babysit them while my parents went shopping. This is when we were a little older. And I always got stuck with the dishes. I did occasional simple cooking, and I was always the one that had to clean up the house where everybody else went out.
I cooked, I cleaned. My mother had never lifted a finger around the house. I did it all.
But I actually enjoyed cleaning house. I mean, to go into a room that was a disaster and walk out, and you could look back, and you'd swear that a drill sergeant had been through there taking care of it. I had a real sense of pride. It's perverse for a little kid to have those aspirations.
When my father passed away, I cleaned the house. I did the ironing. I took care of all of them, my younger brother and sister. I went on dates. I'd take my younger sister, Norma, with me.
I never enjoyed doing dishes much except for the neighbors. I'd go over and wash dishes all night long, but I didn't want to wash them at home.
I was always the one who was worried about everybody. Was everyone happy? Was everyone comfortable? Because I grew up being that person for my mother.
And the other kids had to do some things too, but, I got all the difficult, technically tough stuff. As a part of my dad's ministerial efforts, he also started a radio program on a radio station in Braddock, which was, steel mill country and even Westinghouse manufacturing country. It was called WLOA, and the program was sponsored by a florist. It was Shackelford's Florist, which I think they exist yet today. And when my Uncle George got back from Europe at the end of the war, he also had inclinations to the ministry. And his wife, my Aunt Arlene, who was my mom's sister, youngest sister, the four of them got together and amplified this radio broadcast. They called themselves the Young People's Gospel Team of the Air. So I guess I had a reasonable singing voice. And so I remember, my mom would play the piano in the studio, and I would sing Jesus Loves Me or some other simple songs, probably This Little Light of Mine, I'm going to let it shine. It was probably one of them. And I would sing this over the air on. I think the programs were on Sunday mornings. I remember at one time my sister Judy was going to sing also, and so I had a bit of a devilish streak from time to time, and so I thought, well, I'm just going to act like a music director when she's up there singing. And I knew that I wasn't doing it to be helpful. And, but I just put on my most innocent face, and I'm up there trying to direct her to sing. Of course, it distracted her. She started giggling. My dad gave me one of those looks that would melt nails. And I knew I'd probably crossed a line, so I kind of backed off. When we were going home in the car, my dad didn't want to let it drop. So he started mentioning it, in a very accusatory tone of voice. My mom's defending me. Oh, Clarence, he was just trying to help. He was just trying to direct. And, my dad acquiesced and pretended to be satisfied with that explanation, but I knew he wasn't swallowing it. But it saved me a more serious encounter. After we got home, I was grateful to my mom. I realized how close I had come.